Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sophia Greska, and I direct the USC Institute on Inequalities in Global Health. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's dialogue, Can Reparations Help to End Racial Disparities in Health? With Associate Dean for Social Justice, I love to say that title, Associate Dean for Social Justice, Professor Ricky Blumenthal, and our four incredible panelists. And I want to thank the KSOM Office of Social Justice, the USC Graduate Student Government, and the USC Homelessness Policy Research Institute for co-sponsoring this conversation. Just a couple of things, if I may, to start. This is our last formal IIGH event of the 2023 fall semester. We've had some amazing events, and I couldn't be happier to close out with this critical topic. With Ricky, with Carolyn Diamond on our team, we've been thinking about and planning this event since August. So I'm really grateful for how it's come together and for you all for being here. And I wanted to say something quickly, just in terms of the conversation today being inspired by the amazing 2023 California Reparations Task Force report. And our panelists are going to share more, but just to say the kind of basic framing of this, which is that in September 2020, Assembly Bill 3121 established the task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. And it charged the task force with studying the institution of slavery and its lingering negative effects on living African Americans, including descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, and on society. And the task force was asked to recommend appropriate remedies of compensation, rehabilitation, and restitution for African Americans, with a special consideration for descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. So this past June, the task force issued its final report, and it surveyed the ongoing and compounding harms experienced by African Americans. And they proposed a comprehensive reparations plan for California. So our conversation today is going to jump off from the final report, and it's incredibly exciting, and we're really grateful to have two members of the task force on our panel. I do feel the need, if I may, just to say something quickly as to why, as the Institute on Inequalities in Global Health, we felt so compelled to put together an event on reparations in California. So first is, I think, as we all know, global health starts with wherever home is, whether that be Los Angeles or anywhere else. And health inequalities and disparities exist everywhere, which means policy conversations have to start locally. And we're here in Los Angeles, so here we are. But second is the connection between access to healthcare and the economic, social, cultural, and political determinants of health, and the persistent individual and communal health disparities that exist alongside the history of slavery here in the United States, where we live and where we're based. The truths of health today for all communities cannot be disentangled from the systems that got us here. The task force report is great. I have to say it's long, but it's great. And it addresses health across all areas of its policy recommendations, from wealth gaps to housing, to mental and physical harm, to environmental hazards and neglect. And as someone engaged primarily on the health side, this effort by the task force to reinforce the importance of interdisciplinary efforts to address health in the conversation about reparations is something I really, really appreciate. And with that, I'd like to thank and turn it over to the moderator for today's event, Professor Ricky Blumenthal, who, as well as being the KSOM Associate Dean for Social Justice and our department's Vice Chair for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, is a professor in the Department of Population and Public Health Sciences at the Keck School of Medicine. And I'm sure many of you know his amazing work. But I want to take this moment to thank him for being such an awesome colleague and a wonderful friend, and truly just say I'm so grateful to be sharing this space with you. So with that, Ricky, I turn it over to you to introduce our panelists and to take it from here.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Gruskin, and right back at you. One of the great joys of joining the faculty at USC was having you join right after I did. So I've really enjoyed working with you on this, and every time we have a chance to meet. So I'm really excited to moderate this conversation with four people I've met, some of whom I've known for a very long time, all of whom I admire deeply. And I'll do short introductions of each and then get the conversation going. Before I do that, let me just read a short acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are currently on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Tabaga, Chumash, Kiz nations, and we honor them and all indigenous people, past, present, and future, and we pay respect to their continued survival and contributions to this society. So I'll go in no particular order with just brief introduction. So I'm pleased that we're joined by Dr. Cheryl Grills, who's been on the faculty at Loyola Marymount University for 36 years, where she's a professor of psychology, director of their Psychology of Applied Research Center, and the president's professor in the College of Liberal Arts. She's been doing community engaged research and advocacy for decades in Los Angeles, and is well known to people who are interested in social justice and improving things in our society. And she was also a commission member. Next, let me introduce my colleague, Dr. Lavona Lewis, who is Vice Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and a teaching professor in the public policy at the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy. She's also been engaged for decades in social justice work, addressing health disparities for a wide variety of issues and contributing as a scientist. Next, let me introduce Manuel Pastor, who's a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity and director of the Equity Research Institute at the USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. Dr. Pastor is well known, an accomplished author who's contributed tremendously to understanding social change and facilitating it in our country and in California. And then lastly, let me introduce Reggie Jones Sawyer, who currently represents the 57th Assembly District in Los Angeles. He was first elected to the state legislature in 2012, and I can speak to this personally, is a real progressive champion, and certainly in my review on the right side of history. And let me just point out something else that I did not know about him, which was that he was one of the Little Rock Nine. So he's been in the struggle his entire life in very direct ways in terms of trying to help us have a better society. And let me just, before I get to the questions, just also say, I'm a sociologist by training. I spent a lot of time thinking about these kinds of issues, and I'm just so impressed by the work of the commission. It is thorough, thoughtful, rigorous, and deeply historical. And so I feel like, I don't know if there's an individual, I know it must have been a group effort, but it's a tremendous piece of scholarship in my view. And so the people who were involved in generating the report and people who were on the commission should be, I think, very proud of their contribution. If you only have time to read the executive summary, it's 100 pages, but it's really worth it. And so I recommend everyone who's interested in taking a look at it. All right, so let's start. Let me start with Dr. Grills, and then I'll go to Assembly Member Joe Sawyer. Yeah. Sorry. So the first question is, can you tell the audience in just a few minutes about the process and goals of the California Reparations Task Force report? How does the task force define reparations? And from the report, what do you see as the most compelling policy recommendations? And then specifically those related to health. So Dr. Grills?
So you said I have, an hour?
Yeah.
So the task, first of all, thank you for holding this event. This is so important, and I'm glad to see a light being shown on the issues of health. So the task force was born out of an exhaustive and extensive, multifaceted process to essentially bear witness to and to reveal the truth about California and anti-Blackness, and to show how to repair the harms that occurred. So to the first part of your questions, the task force held close to 200 hours of public hearings in 15 public meetings with more than 100 witnesses, including a community engagement component that included dozens of community listening sessions. We conducted community surveys and a statewide poll, and produced, of course, the hundreds of pages of public document. So much of our community engagement process was led by the Ralph Bunche Center at UCLA. And that involved 7 what we call anchor community-based organizations. And they hosted 17 community listening sessions, engaged 867 people. I'm a researcher, so I gotta give the data. And in that community survey and poll, we surveyed over 4,000 Californians. And so the task force actually convened in June 2021. By June 2022, we issued the interim report. That was a near 500-page publication that essentially draw a through line from the harm of 246 years of enslavement, 90 years of Jim Crow and racial terror, and decades more of continuing discrimination, resulting in the outcomes we see today, including outcomes in terms of health and mental health. I will say that in terms of how we define reparations, for me, ultimately, reparations is about building a better future by correcting for past injustices. We followed, and we were required to follow a framework as a task force, and that framework was essentially grounded in the United Nations standards for reparations, which has 5 components. There has to be compensation, restitution, apology, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. So in conclusion about the reparations, what does it mean part? The reparations are responses, programmatic, financial, and healing, that are justified on the basis of past harm, the legacy of those harms, and the continuation of harm. And the responses in terms of reparations should be designed to assess and correct harms in their multiple forms and frames. Lastly, I'll say that this process has to include reversing a very harmful racial narrative. In part, that can be achieved by truth-telling, policies, and structures. But it also has to be something that's not a top-down process, but it also has to be bottom-up and inside-out. And then lastly, on the question about what's the most compelling policy recommendation with respect to health specifically, I struggle with that question, that part of the question, because there's no magic bullet. The harms, even within the area of health and mental health, were multifaceted. And so the repairs need to be equally multifaceted. What I will say to folks who are particularly interested in this area, the impact on health and mental health, if you look at our interim report, there are 3 chapters in particular that are essential to understanding what policies are needed. Chapter 3, which is on racial terror, Chapter 8, which is on pathologizing the Black family, and Chapter 12, which looks at the mental and physical harm and neglect. And these 3 chapters collectively present that through line that I mentioned earlier, showing the connection between the past and the present as it relates to the mental and physical health of Black folk. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much. And let me just point out as we go along, if you have questions that you'd like to ask, please use the question button at the bottom to put those in. Assembly Member Joan Sawyer.
Thank you, and it's good to see Dr. Grills, because we spent the last 2 years of our life working on this, and it was not easy. But let me just start with a little clarification. My uncle was one of the Little Rock Nine, Jefferson Thomas, one of the young kids that integrated Central High School in 1957. I was born in 1957, so I'm not 80 years old, even though I may look young, but I'm not that young.
Apologies.
No problem. And it's important because that's why I wanted to get involved in this process, because I felt that I owed back to a lot of people whose shoulders I stand on. I also want to make sure that we thank Dr. Weber, because she created the framework that we're using now, which I think was brilliant, because the first part of the analysis was about doing the analysis and proving that in California, California was complicit in racial bias here in California and keeping African Americans from being able to succeed here in California, even though per se slavery was not here, but the practices of slavery were brought west here. And in that first document that was done a couple of years ago, 400 pages, really detailed and outlined. The second part of that, which Dr. Weber had outlined in her bill, was to come up with recommendations. And I think we have over 112 different recommendations that both State Senator Steve Bradford and myself are going to have to work with the California Legislative Black Caucus to make sure that we can put it in legislative and budgetary language so we then move the needle to make sure we can remove barriers that have prevented us from being able to succeed. Because the way I look at this and the way we're going to present it to the legislature, this is, as it may appear that it's about race because African Americans are going through it first, we looked at it as an opportunity and a boilerplate that anyone can use, where you're LGBTQ, Latino, API, Native American, that you could use what we use to go ahead and seek your own reparations, because it is not just us. And this is a lawsuit, because as we all know in California, Prop 209, we can't go with a racially biased argument because it will be problematic. And ultimately, probably with this Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, they'll get thrown out. And so when you look at this, this is about looking at the harms. So I would say it's the same as with you see someone polluting a neighborhood with toxics and it runs through the community. Yes, there's been discussion about financial reparations and discussions about apology letters and everything. That's fine and it should be done. But if you don't remove the toxicity that is running through either that community or that neighborhood, you're still polluting. And so what we're trying to do is remove those toxic elements that are in our society right now. And from a personal standpoint, I think this is why this conversation is really important. And because my eyes were opened as someone who has some health challenges, as someone who's been in the workforce for close to 40 years. I've always had medical coverage provided for me by my employer. And I've been lucky to be able to have some of the best medical coverage anyone could get. And so there are people who are in disadvantaged communities that don't have that opportunity, and their plight is much worse than some of the ailments I have. But I'll just give you one example. I used to be a diabetic, and I was pronounced diabetic by Kaiser Hospital. And while I was there, as they were trying to give me metformin, glipizide, and insulin, because what they did is they looked at an algorithm, which I still believe was racially biased toward African Americans. All they saw was a Black man, over 55, a little bit overweight, and sugar levels were a certain level. We're just going to give him drugs and foist that on him. Luckily, I had an African-American nurse who closed the door and said, I am tired of this. What you need to do is change your diet, exercise, lose some weight. We argued about it. I did what she said. I lost 20 pounds. I changed my diet, and I am no longer on insulin or metformin. But it shows that the medical profession looks at African Americans in the way that they categorize us and automatically just push a remedy that we need to address and look at because it may be racially biased and it may be harmful to African Americans. And so that's why this report is so important, that we don't just take what is status quo and actually look at the root causes of why we are having, whether it's heart, low birth rates, the fact that women, African-American women, breast cancer, The number of kidneys, we can't get a kidney transplant. We having kidney problems. We're probably more in dialysis than anyone else in proportion to the number of people that are in our community. All of those, there's a reason for that. And the reason is not because we are Black and our bodies are more prone to having that. There are outside influences that we need to remove to make sure that our health disparities go down. And so I think this report not only highlights that, but we have an opportunity not only do things legislatively, not only coming up with budgetary recommendations so that we can fund some things so that we don't go into those maladies, but most important, we can start looking at ways we can change the way the medical profession looks at us and provides us better care that fits us, not fits them.
Thank you so much. And it's worth noting there is a whole movement, it's just speaking from someone in the medical school, around identifying these things. There's like the kidney one that's focused on African Americans, and then there's some tools that are routinely used that do a worse job of measuring health among African Americans than others. So there's all effort to try and unwind some of this stuff. Let me go to you, Dr. Lewis. Can you tell us about some of the things you see that are connections between health disparities and reparation efforts?
So I guess I'll start with just kind of a basic statement that really acknowledges the fact that health is about opportunities. Our reparations are about opportunities. What we know about our health is like the longer you live is linked to your education and your income. And if you have been denied income for literally generations, that's going to show up in the health disparities as well. And so when you have opportunities to make healthy choices in some spaces, and those opportunities aren't available in other spaces, that has consequences. That is linked to this concern about reparations, because we know we've had policies, we've had decisions that have locked people out of some communities in terms of the opportunities to build wealth. And it's constantly seen over and over and over again how property has been used in the Black community to deny the Black community, again, the accumulation of wealth. And it's generational. My family has 150 acres in Oklahoma, and there are people who are in Texas who is trying to get the money that is owed to them because the oil was extracted out of their land because somebody denied their ownership of the land. And so this whole idea of the stress of trying to get someone to acknowledge that these things are not just historical, but they're present. This whole issue in terms of trying to make ends meet is about reparations. People that are living day to day with the stress of wondering whether or not they're going to have enough food to eat, or whether or not their family is going to live on the street. All of those things are about restitution, because I mean, it's an acknowledgement in terms of just acknowledging the need for repair. I think that to talk about it in terms of the responding to the harm that's been done for generations, and acknowledging that in many ways it's not just about what's in our DNA, but it's also this idea in terms of, again, the places where we have to make our decisions about what we're going to do in terms of physical activity. Again, this idea of some places you're very comfortable walking, some places you can't walk because there's broken glass, there are dogs, there aren't any trees that provide shade. All of those things are related to reparations, because again, if you can't buy into those places that support healthy living, and what you have is people blaming you for the choices that you're making in the community without acknowledging the fact that the choices that are available are very, very different. And so again, a healthy diet is easy when you're in a place where access to healthy options is also easy. But again, whether you call it a food desert, a food swamp, food apartheid, whatever the terminology is, it's acknowledging the fact that opportunities for healthy choices are not uniformly distributed. And so consequently, opportunities for health and long life are not uniformly distributed. And so I would say that is going back to why reparations are important for health. Again, it's like it begins with the value that we place on people. And so long as we look at people as property, then we're not looking for, again, solutions that take care of them better than we're doing right now. And so I will stop and pass the baton to my colleague.
Thank you. So, Dr. Petzler, maybe respond to this question, maybe with drawing some of your expertise in environmental justice, because I don't know that we've talked about that yet.
So, first thing I want to say is when this report came out, I think I felt a little bit like one feels about one's best student. It's a really great report, but 1,000 pages long, and then a 75-page executive summary. Congratulations. Were you guys overdoing it though? But let me say a couple things that I think are really important and perhaps undersung in terms of praises about the report. First is that when people generally, not the folks who are in the task force, think about reparations, they immediately go back to slavery. What I think is really important about this report is it acknowledges that there was only about 4,000 or so enslaved folks in California, but then it details the history of racism in California, the vibrant activity of the Ku Klux Klan, the asset stripping that went on as a result of redlining, the unequal education system, the fact that California basically outdid the nation over incarceration and racist incarceration. So I urge people to actually look at the report because it makes a case for reparations that's tied to asset stripping over several hundred years and not simply to the era of slavery. One of the reasons why I think this is important is because I like to describe California's racial history as racism Lollapalooza. There was just enough for everyone. I mean, we saw the decimation of indigenous people in the state of California at a rate that was incredible, from about 300,000 indigenous folks to about 30,000 by the time the Spanish and the quote unquote Americans were done. Of course, this land was taken from Mexicans, and this is a place that perfected anti-Asian racism and asset stripping. So one of the things I think is important about this report, and I think more could be done about pointing out how anti-Blackness set the terrain for xenophobia and asset stripping from so many other populations, because we need to give, and Assemblyman Reggie Sawyer-Jones was clear about doing this, about this needs to be done for other populations as well, but really having an integrated public education campaign about this is absolutely crucial. So people realize that this is a contemporary phenomena, and people realize that this speaks to the experience of multiple groups as well. A couple of things that I think are really useful answering the actual question that Dr. Blumenthal answered, because as Ricky knows, if you're an academic, you first answer the question you hope got asked, and then you turn to the question that was actually asked. I think it's incredibly powerful, the mental health issues that Dr. Grills pointed out, the sort of physical health issues that the Assemblyman pointed out, but the environmental justice pieces here are absolutely crucial. The report calls for increasing green spaces, tree canopy, and addressing environmental injustice. In that sense, and if you look at the data in California, a Black family in the Bay Area, for example, has a much higher chance, if it's a family with $100,000 in income, of living near a toxic facility than a white family in the Bay Area making $25,000 of income. If you're looking at the disparities in terms of environmental exposure, they're quite sharp by race. And here in Los Angeles County, the history of oil drilling, which has particularly strong impacts in Black communities, has been central to the campaigns of recent years to eliminate oil drilling and address those harms. And this is a form, when you think about the asset stripping that goes on with redlining, it's collective asset stripping, but it's individual asset stripping. But this environmental injustice is an attack on collective health and collective wealth of the Black community, Latino and Asian communities as well. So I think it's really important that this gets lifted up, and it did in this report. One thing that does also get lifted up in this report is the need to conduct a racial impact analysis of every new policy that's proposed. And I am heartened that there's now a California Racial Equity Commission that's been appointed. I'm a little disappointed that I got appointed to it. The reason I did is because I was one of the people calling for such an analysis. And of course, you have to be careful when you call for things that people may then call for you to actually be involved in thinking about how to implement it. But I think this is really important because reparations is not just about addressing past harms. It's about assuring full participation in the current moment of policymaking. And it's about ensuring that we don't inadvertently make mistakes with new policies, that we don't say, wow, we're going to repair the past harms of asset stripping in Black and Latino communities, but in this case in Black communities, by ensuring that there's public investment. That's a good thing. But what if that public investment triggers gentrification and displacement? We need to be thinking ahead to the potential harms that could be caused by the policies we put in place to try to deal with the past. So I think that's also another very important thing about this report, which gets just a very few lines, but the idea of doing a racial impact analysis on all new policy, very, very key, so we don't reproduce the past, even if we've got good intentions.
Sorry. Thank you for that, Dr. Pastor. So I guess the next question I'd like to ask is, and this will be for you, Assembly Member Joe Sawyer. I mean, you recognize the tenacity of some of these structural relationships and mechanisms in society. And policy can be powerful, but it can be difficult to sort of right size it. And I know in the California legislature, where there are like 5,000 bills introduced every year, difficult to get things passed. And then there's a whole separate budget thing. So if it costs money, it's even exponentially harder to get passed. So just in terms of if you were thinking about policy solutions, what are a couple of things maybe that people should be focused on in terms of getting the legislature to adopt something that perhaps a governor would sign?
What I've been doing is asking for people to get involved, no matter who they are, and give us recommendations on how we can resolve and move forward with reparations. Because some of the best ideas do not come from elected officials or from the administrative group. They come from regular folk. The other thing is, when I'm working with my colleagues, we have a huge educational opportunity. I look at it as an opportunity. And it is difficult, especially when you're dealing with individuals who have kind of white MAGA Republican ideas that will say that if you help minorities or African Americans in particular, you're being racist toward white people. And they've used a reverse psychology to try to stifle anything that we're doing. And so we're going to work real hard to tell them to, basically take your hood off and see what's really going on. Because once you see the impacts that are going on, I think it'll be much easier for you to join us in this effort to remove barriers. Because I think most people are good at heart, but we get wrapped up in our own different political extremes, whether it's progressive or conservative. We don't look at this as a progressive or conservative. We're talking about doing the right thing. And part of that right thing, and one of the first things we want to do, is really work on an apology letter. We think that would be the first step at really starting the healing, the education, the acceptance, the understanding of what we've been going through for the last 2 years and what we're trying to do in the future. Having the governor not only sign that apology letter, but to have other members of the assembly join in signing on, I think we'll have a message that will be something that will show that at the end of the day, we're all in this together. And so we have our work cut out for us. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. As I was looking at the question about politicizing things, somehow we're going to have to work to talk about facts and not get into hyperbole and not get strayed, because people are talking about, you know, every African American in California gets $2 million. That's a distraction. Reparations is more, as you heard from the other speakers. Reparations is more than just cash payments. In fact, out of 112, that's not even at the top of the order. There's a plethora of things that we need to address that we can. Some are already ongoing and in place, and that we can automatically just make sure it gets done. They're probably at the 10-yard line, and we just need to push them across. And then there's some, obviously we got to start from the other side, but what we can do, we will do. Mr. Bradford and I, for example, this is our last year. So it is imperative that we get everything started. We're not going to be able to do this in 1 year. We may not be able to do this in 5 years. And we're going to leave this to other California Legislative Black Caucus members to complete this task for us, because it is a monumental task to change the way California has been. And the legislature can start this. We just got to make sure we had to do this correctly.
And Dr. Groves, what would you prioritize following the sort of thinking that Assemblymember John Sawyer shared?
I would prioritize in terms of mental health. I think that we overlook the vast divide in access to quality mental health services. And given the level of multi-generational strain, stress, and racial trauma that has occurred, to me, I can't understand why more Black folk aren't stark raving mad. I mean, our resilience is incredible, but resilience only goes but so far. So what can we do to address the fact that in California, Black folk and other people of color are unserved, underserved, and inappropriately served in the mental health arena? And so how do we prioritize ways of doing that that don't involve forcing us to be subjected to evidence-based practices that were never designed with us in mind, that does not have ample research to demonstrate its effectiveness with us, and that totally ignores our own cultural perspective on what is health and wellness and how does one heal. The other thing that I will say is that we need people to get involved. Our legislators can only go but so far if there is not a groundswell of support backing what they're trying to do. And so I'm kind of jumping a little bit ahead, but I want to make sure that people know that we have continued to work, members of the task force. So we had a press release in November, late November or mid-November of this year. The California Black Power Network, Equal Justice Society, and 6 former members of the task force, including myself, Assemblymember Joan Sawyer, Senator Bradford, Professor Jovan Scott Lewis, Attorney Don Tamaki, and Attorney Lisa Holder. And we formed a new collaboration called the Alliance for Reparations, Reconciliation, and Truth. And our mission is to educate the public about reparations, amplify the task force's report and its recommendations, and achieve broad-based, multiracial public support for reparations, because Black people cannot get this across the finish line alone. We need our allies. And as has been said earlier, first they came for us, next they're coming for you, right? So everything that is being done in support of reparations can provide a cover and exposure and attention to the needs of other groups. And we have some real important heavy hitters involved in this alliance, like Catalyst California, Black Equity Collective, and more. I will say too that we have been, in terms of getting this broad sector support, we have been working to get endorsements of the work of the task force. There are different ways people can endorse. And if I'm begging folks, if you are a part of an organization, a university, a research entity, a professional organization or group, consider doing a letter of support or endorsing the work of the task force. And you can go to the website supportreparations.org. And when you go to that website, supportreparations.org, you will see a list. We started out with less than 100 organizations during the latter quarter of the task force. We are now well over 600 organizations. And I'm not talking, Jack and Jill Club, although they might endorse if they so desire. But I'm talking about ACLU. I'm talking about, on the national level, the National Urban League. I'm talking about a number of bar associations. I'm talking about all of the ethnic psychological associations nationally in the country. They've all endorsed. This is a massive thing. And this shows that there is support, contrary to popular media that would try to suggest that we've got this groundswell of folks who are saying reparations should not be happening for Black folk under no circumstances. No, that's not the case. There is a large amount of multi-sector, multiracial support, but we need more.
So we're coming to a little bit towards the end. So I want to give Dr. Pastor and Dr. Lewis a chance to say a little bit more about this. And in particular, I think what I want to ask Dr. Pastor, and then Dr. Lewis, you can just pick up. So what I want to ask you, Dr. Pastor, is about you're deeply enmeshed in community organizing in Los Angeles and Southern California. And I just would appreciate a perspective on the relationship of those ongoing efforts with reparations. And then if Dr. Lewis, if you could identify for us some things that the USC community could be doing that would be in communication or conversation with these efforts, I'd appreciate that.
I would say that there's broad sympathy in the progressive community organizing world for reparations, but there needs to be much more serious dialogue about what's in the report, what's being asked for, and a point that both Assemblyman Joan Sawyer and Dr. Grills were making, which is how does this set a template for general improvement in our society, for people of color, but really for our society as a whole. If we have this level of incarceration and mental harm and trauma that's being done, think about the potential that's being wasted that could be used for economic growth, for creativity, for innovation, for growing our economy. When you think about the level of underinvestment in education for Black and Brown kids, which shortchanges our future as a state. And then when you think about the persistent asset stripping, particularly in the Black community, that makes it difficult for people to amass wealth and then be able to take a chance on education, take a chance on starting a business, etc. That is shortchanging not just the Black community, which it is, and that would be enough to motivate concern, but it's shortchanging our society as a whole. So I actually think we need a much more massive public education campaign. It's great that so many organizations have signed up, as Dr. Grills was pointing out. But what you really want as well is a grassroots understanding of why this is important. And partly it's because it's that kind of work that, for example, within the Latino community, would allow us to have more handles to tackle the anti-Black racism that reared its ugly head in the form of 4 Latino civic leaders that embarrassed themselves and embarrassed our community with the way that they were articulating their concerns. And so we need much more grassroots work on these kind of issues. And I'll let Dr. Lewis talk about what it is we need to do at the university, but a whole lot more there as well.
So thank you for that. I think fundamentally, university has a responsibility to help young people to understand what they don't know and to fill in those knowledge gaps and to create a desire to know more and do more. The fact that we are currently in a time in our country where we've decided that knowing less should be the priority, should be kind of a rallying call for every institution of higher education to recognize what's at stake. And so for me to think about the university, I think about university as an education center. I also think about the university as an anchor institution that is able to establish connections in terms of, connecting people to meaningful work, whether that work be helping to elevate some of the messages of the report, whether that meaningful work be doing some of the research that's important to kind of make sure that the aspirations of the report actually get realized. But I think fundamentally we have to recognize that to do nothing is educational malpractice. And I think that's kind of where we are, this idea that we have to fight back against those who say knowing less is value added for us as a society, and to deal with that issue head on. Some people can call it reverse racism. Some people can call it denialism. But the bottom line is that we are in the midst of it's not a culture war. For me, it's a war about humanity. Are we in a position where we recognize that just because it wasn't true for you doesn't mean that it hasn't been true for other generations of people? And to kind of elevate that message in a systematic way, using the report as leverage in doing that. Again, I think that there are multiple opportunities. If we're not asking some of our classes to be using this material, again, that for me is educational malpractice, because again, it's recognition that we have an obligation. For me, for folks who question the value of higher ed, we can begin to talk about it in terms of putting people out into society that are able to have reasonable discussions about very tough topics. And again, survival is a very tough topic, but that's what reparations is really all about. And I will stop there.
Ricky,
Okay. Yeah, please.
Very quickly. I think that this report illustrates something else, maybe a little more buried. I often have students approach me. They've just learned about social injustice. They've just begun to understand the racist history of the United States and California, and they're fired up and they really want to do something about it. And they come to me and ask what they should do. And I think what they think I'm about to say is go to a demonstration. But the first thing I say is, wow, you should learn GIS, Geographic Information Systems, so you can map hazards in the community. You should learn data analysis so you can put together the kind of careful arguments that are in the long version. It's in the executive summary too, but in the long version of this report, which tries to make an impeccable, evidence-based, data-rich case for addressing injustice. So I actually think it's also a call for us to think about how to skill build, create capacities with our students to be able to be the most effective warriors, not just in terms of shouting for social justice, but in terms of marshaling evidence and analysis and policy so that Assemblyman Jones Sawyer can make sure that it gets implemented.
Thank you for that. That's great. You know what, a theme I think that's come up and we haven't addressed directly, but it's talking about education is like part of that. And we haven't talked about this, but I'll just introduce the idea. So, there is this idea of white supremacy, which might be understood basically just as I'm trying to be very neutral, in a like organization of the world that people are comfortable with, right? That sort of centers white experience. And some of the pushback, right, to this is like expanding that aperture to include other groups meaningfully and in a useful way. So I guess I wonder, is there a and this is coming out of the blue, so I'm just gonna put it out there. So apologies to the discussants. Is there a political movement or approach that needs to be taken with white communities that help them understand these materials and receive them in a way that can allow them to be activated in a helpful way around these topics, rather than sort of the resentment fueled politics that we've really observed for the last 7 or 8 years?
I think one of the things that both Dr. Grill's group that I belong to and the California Legislative Black Caucus, we realized we're going to have to put together a marketing campaign, because when you explain things to people, and it's unfortunate that the professors are absolutely right. Some of this is nuanced, some of this you need to go into detail, but that's not how we receive information right now. And we have to market it in a way where they're able to not only receive it and understand it in very short terms, that we are able to mobilize people on that. The examples I use, and I'm not saying we should advocate for this, but I think people wanted to have greater accountability in policing, and they wanted to make sure that police forces weren't occupying forces and things of that nature. Instead of saying have more mental health professionals out on the street and all that, and that's a lot. What we said was defund the police. That had a whole, that created a whole movement that in some ways was maybe not exactly what the original intent was, but then it became a whole nother thing. So we also have to be very careful that whatever we put out there, we're going to do that. So the legislature has, the CLBC has looked at several different groups or marketing groups that we could hire. We're going to raise money so they can help us do that. A lot of that is in line with, if everybody remember, the Crown Act. The Crown Act had a marketing firm to make that happen. And it was because of them that it really helped to catch fire to where it became a cause and something that everyone could get behind. We're looking at the same type of momentum, in addition to putting together what Dr. Grills and others are doing, is that social group that's coming together, that movement. But we're going to need songs. We're going to need slogans. We're going to need all of that too. We're going to need commercials. We're going to have to hit the social media. We've got to use every tool in the toolbox to be able to get our message out the right way, and also be able to counter messages that come back that are there to derail what we're going to do. And there are people out there that are very good at mounting their own marketing effort to derail what we're doing. And we have to be sensitive to that. But most important, we have to be ready for that, because that is coming. And as I tell my colleagues, you haven't seen the worst of it yet. Wait till we really start putting out some budgetary recommendations and some legislative bills. That's when the action will really start.
Dr. Rose?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. There's a couple of things that I wanted to kind of share. One is that this opposition that we see to Black reparations, in part, that opposition, particularly when it's coming from the white community, focuses on a temporal dislocation, if you will, right? A temporal dislocation between enslavement and the present. It was all in the past. And so our report really was intentionally trying to say, we're not just talking about the past, and the past informs and directs and shapes the present. So we've got to make sure there's a lot of education about this is the past and the present. Secondly, we've had a problem with differences in worldviews in terms of the arguments for reparations. Most of us who are reparationists, if you will, have been arguing the point from a collectivist view, that I may not personally have done X, Y, or Z, but we have to be concerned with the greater good. And the kind of broader, particularly white community, has been giving counter arguments from an individualistic point of view that, you know, I didn't have anything to do with it. I didn't benefit from it. I wasn't there, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got to figure out how to bridge that cultural worldview divide. Third, what people have to understand is that when it comes to the harm that was done, it wasn't just Black folk that were harmed. Everybody got contaminated. Everybody got infected with this virus of racism. And so now you have entire groups of people who are jockeying to get as close to white adjacent as they can by any means necessary, and losing perspective on the fact that there is a greater good that needs to be addressed, and that we all need to figure out how have we personally and within our group been harmed by this kind of racist anti-Black narrative, including, you know, down to folks' basic identity of who they are. You know, what does it mean to be white? What does it mean to have an identity grounded in white supremacy? And what has being in the midst of prolonged and massive suffering done to my own humanity if I haven't been part of the solution, if I haven't been aware? And so as Dr. King said, we will have to repent, not only for the vitriolic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people.
Well, I can't think of a better place to stop this. Very eloquent ending. If we could put up the final slide. Let me just once again just say how much I admire each of our speakers. I really appreciate deeply their willingness to both work on these topics and then share their perspectives and opinions about how to move forward. I hope you've all benefited as much as I have. I mean, I'm a sociologist, so I sort of study inequality as sort of what we do in conflict. I have to say, reading the report has advanced my education substantially. And so I appreciate those efforts and hope that you'll join all of us in the future in the events by the USC Institute on Inequalities and Global Health and the activities put on by the Office of Social Justice in the medical school. And then lastly, please do go and check out the website. You have couple of recommendations about other places to go, including support reparations.org and the Alliance for Reparations. So take a look at that if you get a chance and have a great end to the semester. And thanks for joining us today.